It's been a minute.
Oh, you're videoing.
I can control it from my watch.
Absolutely incredible.
Okay, so we're back.
We are back. Are you ready for this?
Never.
My one suggestion, the one thing I hope that happens, that I'll be the same age by the time we finish these videos. I really want you to know that. It's been a minute since we did our last video, and we're going to get this 2B or 104, whatever this class is,
Second half.
to the end. Eloy Sarate, storyteller.
Seni Lupicic, historian.
And she's going to start this one.
I'm going to start this one. We are going to talk about Africa, and more importantly, Africa's place in world history. Because if your education in world history has been standard, Africa has, for the most part, been excluded. It has been talked about only in those instances where it crosses the master narrative of European history. You tend to learn about African history because of the slave trade, or because of imperialism, or because of decolonization. Maybe you've learned a little bit of the great man history and you've heard of Mansa Musa. But for the most part, world history doesn't do justice to the important role that Africa occupies in the history of the world.
When I think of Africa, I'm going to go with a little bit of a geographical kind of narrative on this.
I hope you do.
Because when I think of Africa and how Africa was introduced into my education, when it crosses paths with Europe, it's always been crossing paths with Europe, right? But we have some natural geographic and biological and ecological boundaries that really keep Europe and the rest of the world outside of Africa.
Very fair point. I should have said when Europe crosses paths with Africa.
Yes.
Yeah.
We have the Sahara Desert in the north. We have the malaria barrier along the southern parts of the coast. You have a lot of things that kind of keep people from really entering Africa. So when we're crossing paths, we're really crossing paths outside of Africa.
And I think that in what you're saying, you're getting in that geographical telling to one of the other issues that we have in understanding Africa's history, because you're giving a very Western perspective in terms of the Western side of Africa. I'm always struck by the word Sahel, which means coast, and that the Sahara Desert, for people who were crossing it, functioned like a body of water. It was something that you navigated using the stars and that you could travel across. And people we know from antiquity were moving through the Sahara Desert. And we know that you have a very diverse eastern coast of Africa that is tied into the Indian Ocean. A historian referred to it as the intercommunicating zone between Asia, South Asia, and East Africa. So even when we talk about those boundaries or those barriers, we are still talking about it, I think, very much from a Western or European perspective of what kept them out, ignoring that others were very much in communication with the populations, civilizations, empires, and states of Africa.
Well, if we're going to do that,
Okay.
then we can look over our shoulder or in front of or over my shoulder here. When we talk about Africa, we're not talking about one place, right? We're talking about a multitude of places. So I think it's fair, the points that you are bringing up, but there is in terms of our consciousness of Africa, world history is bringing Africa to the center, right? But yet what we're bringing is a gigantic continent with a multitude of people and a multitude of places. And if you've taken our 2A class, right, it's that kind of development of the trade networks that have been happening in Africa and in the eastern part of the world that is bringing everybody else in. So I think that we first have to get the idea of the size and the scope and what Africa is playing in towards the second half of the 2A class and the first half of the 2B class is the idea that Africa is playing a central role.
No argument for me.
Yeah, perfect.
So the picture that Eloy is referring to is one that I'd like to use to underscore just how big an area we are talking about. The common mistake is to refer to Africa like it's a country rather than a continent. And so you'll see the picture that shows how many countries and continents can fit inside of Africa. And so understanding the diversity, when we say African, I would argue that that's really, again, a very Western and American perspective, that we are identifying people by their land mass rather than by their country, by their origin, by who they are. And so it's an important thing to keep in mind.
And also what's important, and it's glad that you just brought up that video or this picture here, is that the history of slavery is just overshadows everything that is going on in Africa. So the end of the 2A and the beginning of the 2B, what you have is Africa not looking westward in terms of the slave trade, but actually eastward into the Indian Ocean. And that has been a central area of trade for about 500 years by the time we start this class.
And for those non-PCC students, 2A first half, 2B second half. But again, sort of that point that you're sitting at a crux and understanding the important and participatory role that Africa has in the world's history. And so as our course is in this wonderful transition period, we always like to start with the Mongols because of this huge connected empire that they create across Eurasia. And you'll have the dominance of the land mass. We like to bring in the importance of the Indian Ocean trade. So you have the water trade. And it's really in that connected space that we want to start the conversation about Africa, because looking at what's been building and developing on the eastern coast is an important part of understanding, again, sort of this connected and significant role that Africa's occupying, whether it's moving through the monsoons, whether it is crossing the Sahara, it is part of a system.
A system that is culturally dominated by Islam. And that is also something that's very important to understand. By the 1500s, Islam, or the Dar of Islam, has connected the world of this old world, right? The old world between Western Africa and Asia and China. Islam is the cultural glue that is tying together all of these continents. And don't forget that Spain is also part of that Dar of Islam. So Islam is the cultural dominant factor that is bringing everybody together and is facilitating the trade and accelerating the trade from east to west that will eventually force different trade partners to look for alternative trade routes to get around Africa and around the Dar of Islam.
So the other misconception that we want to try to confront in thinking about Africa and its place in world history is the view that somehow it was behind, that it was antiquated, that it was a place of tribes where development did not happen, and that is...
Okay, can we just say, if you think of Africa in the dominant narrative, it's full of barbarians, and that is false.
Well, I was going to work my way
Okay,
towards
no, let's just say it.
The dark continent.
Yes.
That is a way that it has been characterized in other historical narratives, in sources. It is a place where light did not shine. And when we talk about light, we mean the light of Western civilization. So this is really where those narratives confront the confrontation of a Western rise of the West, and the idea that if you are not part of that rise, that somehow you are in the dark, you are behind and barbaric.
And we always try to place the dark in terms of unenlightened, right? We always try to put it within the Enlightenment narrative or the rational narrative. But I think we all understand what dark means. It's a pretty racist term, straight out.
Yeah.
Right? And I think we need to make that perfectly clear that the darkness that we're talking about is the racist dominant narrative created by the West.
So it's much easier to perpetuate that narrative if you also say that there were no civilizations, there were no empires, there were no kingdoms. And any scholar working in Africa will have plenty of evidence to the contrary. Enormous walled cities, complex cities. You have an incredibly urban population in West Africa in particular. That was where our mentor did his work, and you had a more urbanized population in the early modern Ghana, Songhay, Malian empires than you will in the United States all the way until the Great Depression. More people lived in or around a city in the kingdoms of gold and salt than live in or around a city until you get really to World War II in the United States. So it's incredibly urban, it's structured, it's organized. We tend to give the great man story to Mansa Musa, but he's one of many great kings and rulers over very complex societies.
And if you want to talk about the tricks of evidence, that I know is one of the videos, if you don't like that narrative and you don't want to civilize Africa, then there's this nice trick that we do. We take these incredible kingdoms and places and we take them out of Africa and say they're part of the Mediterranean world. You know, those aren't part of Africa really. You know, Egypt isn't really part of Africa. You know, Constantinople isn't really part of that. You know, it's not part of this area. But it's on the continent. Well, it really isn't. So again, racism is central to this narrative, and we will keep fighting against that narrative. There are empires, there are civilizations, there are urban cities. All of that is happening, not just along the coasts, but inside the center of Africa. And it is central, and that is why it is central to the world's history.
And I think your point is an important one because you started by saying you wanted to do geographical, but that's where you get cultural narratives transgressing, to use a Senya word, transgressing the geography, saying, well, it's not part of Africa because the Sahara separates and creates a cultural barrier. So we can safely say that even though on any map it's in Africa, culturally it's not. And so you get all sorts of racist gymnastics.
And it's gymnastics. And we want you to get used to hearing those types of narratives.
So as we're talking about the second half of world history and Africa's place in that, as Aloy said, the slave narrative, the narrative of enslaved people and the slave trade is really the lens through which we have looked at the history of Africa. And I think that it's really important to understand with those barriers, things like malaria, things like difficult harbors, things like currents and winds that are going to keep people from entering, at least on the western coasts of Africa, for a very long time. That when they do arrive, when Europeans do begin to interact with Africans, they are not coming in a dominant role. That is something that the narrative will attribute to them much later. They are coming seeking trade and trying to gain the favor of these important kings and kingdoms. They are trying to win their way through whatever they need to do, whether that means bringing commodities and goods that are the most desirous and luxurious to the African rulers, whether that means coming on bended knee, bowing before the throne to get the favor of these rulers. This is a part of the narrative that we don't tell. We never give the African kingdoms agency in trade the way that we give to Europeans coming in.
And that brings in the idea when we're thinking about the slave trade, we're thinking about an economic structure. So even though it's very hard for us to think in those terms, we have to think that way. When the slave trade becomes a dominant economic structure, the world's economy has changed. So if you look at before the slave trade is the dominant economic structure, how was Africa structured at that time, economically, socially, and politically, that their relationship with Europeans will change. And that in the second half of the class, we want you to be aware of these transformations.
And so we will get to a lecture where we talk about the Atlantic world and we talk about the trade in enslaved peoples. But for right now, in this week's content, what we really want to see you paying attention to and what we want you to be tracking as you study are those things that are confronting what you thought you knew about Africa. This is really the place to explore the limits of what you've been taught previously. If the things that we've said in this introductory video don't fit with images that you've seen, with movies that you've watched, maybe it's time to start digging a little deeper. And we're going to be providing lots of resources to try to get you to think about the scale of the continent, the diversity of its populations, the complexity of the societies that built there. But this is really an opportunity to push up against the things that you haven't had a chance to learn, getting away from sort of the single story or the dominant narrative that we are attributing to a really important place in the world.
So, Africans as kings, not slaves. Living in cities, not villages.
Yeah.
Right?
Participating in tremendous commerce, building incredible libraries, being places where scholars are going. In the lecture, you'll see a little picture from the Disney film, The Aristocats. You know, it's where they shove the butler into a trunk and send him off to Timbuktu, like it's some remote, barren, scary place. And no, it was a huge center of learning. It was a place where libraries and books and scholars all were, where knowledge was shared, and it remains that way today. But Disney wins in terms of how we understand it.
They always do.
Mm.